Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 16 of the Survival Project. Today, I'm joined by Colm Collins, who's an IBD researcher with over 15 years in IBD research. We get into some of the most talked about and some of the most misunderstood topics in IBD, including cannabis use, the gut-brain axis, stress as a trigger, why medications can stop working, and what the future treatment could actually look like with personalised medicine, wearables, and home testing. This episode is supported by Salt's Healthcare, and I want to say a genuine thank you to Salt's for supporting what I'm trying to build here. They're really helping to get these conversations to reach more people. This conversation with Colm is one of the most educational conversations I've ever had. So let's get into it. So Colm, thank you so much for joining me. Would you mind diving into the work you do, please?
Sure, yeah. So I've been working in IBD research for about 15 odd years now. I started off looking at therapeutics and ways to develop therapeutics, and it just kind of spiraled from there to the point where I'm actually working on cannabis now at the moment, which is a bit of a contentious issue within our research field. So the reason I got involved at all is I was working in Colorado right around the time cannabis became legal, and there was a load of interest in it, especially among our patients in Children's Colorado, where we had a lot of teenagers and stuff who were keen to try it. And so there are some good reasons why you might want to try it. Let's start with that. So it's good for things like, it's good at suppressing pains, right? And we know IBD has one of the highest levels of stomach pain, apart from maybe a food poisoning. So it's on the high end, and it's also difficult to manage, right? Because it's a long-term disease. You don't really want to use opioids because they can become addictive. Because of the gut involvement, you don't really want to use something like paracetamol or ibuprofen because they disrupt the mucus that's covering your gut and that's keeping it protected. And so if you disrupt that, if anything, you're probably making your disease worse. And so that's why I think for some people, that was the real reason why they were pushing for using cannabis. It also has been shown that it can reduce your bowel movements. So if you're having 15, 20 bowel movements a day, then it can seem like a real plus. And it also has a great effect on appetite. And we know that, appetite could be a real struggle. Particularly for Crohn's patients. And so anything that can boost your appetite, especially in kind of adolescence when you're at that peak growing kind of phase, it could be beneficial, right? And so in the short term, there's been a couple of clinical trials where they use cannabis. They use either THC or THC, maybe an cannabidiol or together. And the results were initially promising. People felt great. 75 milligrams of cannabis 3 times a day felt absolutely great.
Sign me up.
But the problem was that if you look at long-term use, cannabis actually can make it significantly worse. So we've seen, there was a study from a group called Martin Storr in Canada. And Martin showed that actually cannabis users or Crohn's patients who were using cannabis for more than 6 months had about a 6 or 7-fold increased risk of surgery. So that's a pretty significant increase. And so that got us thinking, well, okay, we can't really turn around to people and say, don't use it. Because obviously, apart from all the other reasons, you wouldn't use it. Like it affects your IQ and it affects your motivation and all these other things. But we can't, without actual good evidence of why you shouldn't use it. We were kind of at a crossroads. And so we started looking into, well, what is it actually doing within your body, right? Because your body has a natural cannabis type system called the endocannabinoid system, and that's what the plant kind of interacts with. But your body has its own version of that, and so when you take immune cells and you start treating them with cannabis or cannabis-like products, we start to see, all the things that cannabis can actually do. And for us, what really scared us from an IBD perspective is there was 2 things we could see that it would do really, really well. One of those is that it makes cells traffic to your intestine. And that's great if you've got MS or if you've got arthritis or if you've got anything that isn't an intestinal disease. In fact, even if you had HIV, that could be really protective. But if you've got inflammatory bowel disease and you're driving cells into the gut, it's basically doing the opposite of what a drug like vedolizumab or Entyvio is trying to do, is reversing that process. And so that would obviously, as far as we're concerned, make people worse. And certainly in long-term animal models, we've seen that it makes the disease significantly worse. And obviously, we're not in the business of trying to make it worse. So we said, right, well, we'll block that. We'll reverse the process. And how will that impact on our long-term models? And sure enough, the opposite happens. Once you stop cells from going into the gut with a drug that blocks the cannabis pathway, now all of a sudden the animals start to do better and the disease starts to drop off. And that's really positive. And then a second thing that it does is it causes almost like the munchies. Your immune cells just start going, mad for, sugar, real low, really unhealthy choices. And so the cells start to just grow and grow and eat constantly. And what that does for them is it means they're much better able to survive long term. And so you develop this sort of memory that you really, it's great for stuff like, when you're a baby and you had peanuts and your brain, your immune system writes this, okay, we recognize this, it's fine. So we see it next time, we're not going to react negatively. And that's great. But the reverse can also happen in that your body can see something that it sees as harmful and it reacts really poorly. And it means that when it sees it again, a year or 2 years later, it'll react again and it'll generate this massive negative response. And that's this sort of pathway that we think cannabis can really have a negative impact for patients, is that IBD patients are already prone to have a bad reaction to something in their system. And what cannabis will do is it'll make that last longer. And it means that, they might be fine at the time they take it. They might feel great because it's suppressing their pain and it's reducing their motility. But 6 months later, when they do have a disease flare, that flare is going to be a whole lot worse. And that's why we're seeing this great increase in surgery. So at the moment, it's exciting times at the moment, actually. I've got a great collaborator, Dave O'Connell. So myself and Dave have been working on developing new drugs that we can use that will target that system and basically block it. And so the plan is, they're small, they're really, really, really specific. They don't have any kind of off-target effects. So we're, hopeful that at some point we'll make some progress with it.
Yeah, it sounds like very promising research, and it definitely gives a lot of people hope, because I know there's a lot of research done into like CBD, THC, all the kind of oils. And I know before people have said to me, oh, would you not take CBD oil and different things like that? I have tried them personally. I didn't find any major relief from them. It did help my sleep. But to know that there is research coming down the line of something that could help balance, I suppose, a lot of things where it comes to your nutrition and different things like that is very, very interesting. Just to dive into what's actually happening on a biological level with IBD, could you explain that just a bit for us?
Yeah, so the kind of the real classic way that we think about it is it's like this 4 different factors that come together to cause the disease. So if you imagine, right, the analogy I like is you're in a soccer stadium, right? And a soccer stadium's got 2 different sets of fans, right? You've got your obviously home fans and the away fans, right? Home fans are yourself, right? Your body, your saliva, the cells on the inside of your mouth, all those things and even the food you're eating, like all that stuff that's passing through your body, on its way out or on its way to be recycled or reused or whatever. And then on the other hand, you've got the away team, right? So you've got the bacteria and the viruses and the fungi and all of these things that are kind of cohabitating within that stadium. And then that stadium but within that, you've got bacteria that are looking to get out onto the pitch, right? They're the most aggressive. They're always trying to find a weakness, find a way off, way through that kind of basic barrier that goes around the outside of the pitch. And the barrier is wafer thin. So that's like the intestinal epithelial lining, right? It's really, really thin. It's really, really weak, but somehow it manages to keep all of those bacteria and stuff out and keep you pitch nice and clean on the inside, right? And it's not trivial. And so as long as you've got the diversity, as long as you've only got some of those kind of negative actors and not lots of them, then you're probably okay. And as long as the barrier is fully functioning, you're probably okay. And then, so, the makeup of who's there, that's really important, right? So that's your genetics. So you've got to have a genetic factor. You've got to have bacterial overgrowth. So you've got to have an outgrowth of a specific bad type of bacteria that's looking to invade the pitch. You've got to have leaky barrier of your intestine, even though that's not enough on its own, right? So if you've got Crohn's, your brother has no Crohn's, but you both have very similar leaky gut, more than likely. So it's not enough on its own. None of those things are enough on their own. But if you bring them all together and you lump on top of that a period of some sort of stress, right? So you need a trigger to induce the initial disease in the first place, right? And that stress can be, a period of high stress in your life, bad penalty shout, something like that. Or it could be too much alcohol. There's a reason why they don't serve alcohol on the pitch or, during soccer matches. Or it could be a pitch invasion, right? So something like a viral infection or some sort of injury, kick in the head, anything like that is enough to trigger this onslaught. And then what happens is you get a pitch invasion, and now it becomes the job of your immune system or the stewards to say, right, we can sort this out. And in a healthy individual, that's exactly what happens, right? The stewards pick out the people who are problematic, separate them out, push everyone back in behind the stand, behind the barriers, and everything gets back to normal relatively quickly, and the game can continue. IBD patients have an immune system that's it's like Eric Cantona, right? The 2-footed tackle straight to the face of the irritating fan. It's like that, right? So your IBD patient's immune system's like that. I'm not tolerating this at all. It's all going to kick off. And the problem is once it kicks off, then there's a memory that develops with that, right? So the next time those fans are in that stadium, they're thinking this. this is going to kick off again. I better be proactive and I better start the fight first. And what's worse is when those fans go somewhere else, because they've had that stressful experience and they've had that violent response. When they go to your joints or to your skin or to your eyes, they can trigger your security system that's supposed to be keeping everything nice and calm. All of a sudden decides I'll get aggressive and I'm going to attack everything. And that's why we see with patients, it's not just an intestinal disease that's the problem. It's all those extra intestinal manifestations that cause the problem. So you need the genetics, right? So there's a genetic factor, but that's not enough on its own. I was saying some before, 40% of twins who both have exactly the same DNA, both going to get the disease. So that's really not enough by itself. And we know that there's been great work by people like Dermot McGovern identifying genes that we say, well, if you have this, you're more likely to get the disease. Or if you have these two together, more likely again. But we can't identify without question, okay, yeah, 100%, you're definitely going to get it. So that's a factor. Your immune system is a factor. You need to have, your immune system is seeing the same thing as everybody else, but it's how it's reacted is different. And that's just hardwired. Once that memory is formed, it's very hard to shift it. Then you need the microbiome, you need the diversity in your microbiome. And that comes, it's ironic, that comes from increase in diet diversity, so a very diverse diet. So countries where they've got a very strict diet, minimalist diet, we don't see a whole lot of IBD cases. And then the last thing is, where am I at? Environment, genetics, bacteria, and your immune system. Yes, that's it. That's all four. I just can't count.
Yeah, that's the four kickers. No, that's perfect. I just want to circle back to what you said about a stress can actually induce it. Is that proven?
Yes. So sorry, in terms of stress, in terms of bacteria getting across the gut, yeah, 100%.
Okay.
So there's bacteria that can sense your stress hormones like adrenaline and stuff like that, and they just see that as an opportunity to grow and invade, and that really is a big factor for people. And if you talk to when I've talked to patients about it, one of the we talked about times that come up as kind of recurring issues, and it's stuff like, oh well, I changed from my pediatric doctor who I'd been seeing for 16 years, and he knew me really well, and he was great. And I went to this new adult doctor because I was going to a different college and I was doing this, that, the other. And you're like, it might not be the doctor. It might be the fact that you went to live somewhere totally new by yourself and had the stress of college and everything else. Getting married is also another really unfortunate one that, right around the time you're about to get married, obviously it's hugely stressful and that can trigger another flare. So we do know that there is a certain level of stress involved.
I know myself, stress can be a trigger. Once I've been diagnosed, stress would be a trigger to exacerbate my symptoms. But for years, I had this hypothesis from talking to people that stress could actually be the trigger to start your Crohn's flare-up in the first place. Like that was the one that it activated something. It's the first time I've actually heard the words out of someone's mouth that it is actually a component in it. Because I remember saying it years ago to someone anyway, and they shut me down being like, no, we don't know why it causes it, but it's not that. And I was like, okay, fair enough. So it's great to hear that bit of information because that's something I know myself from my own experience and talking to people is a major factor in it. But that's wicked interesting.
I mean, I will say there's the exceptions. So, for example, we have this thing called very early onset IBD. So these are kids who have a specific disease or specific genetic factor that really drives the disease. And that comes almost in, once they hit kind of 1 or 2 years of age, once they start solid food, really. So that's a separate animal. But then after that, there's a huge spectrum as to when people will develop the disease. And so, for years, we've looked for stuff like there was a thing called Mycobacterium avium. So this was an infection that people who have IBD seem to have slightly higher than average levels of antibodies against this particular thing in their system. And it was like, oh, well, maybe if you get that, it triggers it. But so there was a work by a Professor Fiona Powery over in the UK, and she looked at all of the immune cells and how they respond and what exactly it is they're responding to. And she found that there wasn't a single trigger. So it must be something different for different people. Like I said, you get a knock in the head, that's enough to cause a little bit of gut permeability, and then it triggers the disease. Or you get the cold or you get a flu, that triggers an immune reaction. That normally would go away, but in this case, it just doesn't. But anything can trigger that.
And in the sense of, we all know that to have a very good microbiome, we need a diverse intake of different types of foods. And then you said before that in areas that they kind of follow a strict diet, there's less IBD cases. Would that kind of sing to the thing that maybe eating to your locality might be kind of preferable to the body's kind of makeup?
Yeah, so it's kind of counterintuitive to a certain extent, right? So the most extreme example we can use is parenteral nutrition, right? So feeding with a feeding tube with, what can only be described as a very unpleasant experience for anybody. There's a reason why you can't get adults to do it, for example. But what that does is it gives you a diet that's so restrictive that there isn't that kind of diversity of things that are stimulating your immune system. And because there's a lack of that diversity, people's disease seems to respond really well. And it seems to pretty much alleviate a lot of patients' symptoms.
Very interesting, because I know myself, I followed very strict diets to alleviate symptoms, and it did work, definitely. But that I won't say it's a one size fits all for a lot of things, but very, very interesting component to it.
Yeah, and it's definitely not a one size fits all. Like, so, we know there's some foods that are associated with like trigger foods, like things like tomatoes seem to be a trigger for a lot of people. Coffee, alcohol, all these things. There's stuff. There are some that we think are fairly general, but then after that, it's very individual to individual patients.
100%. And one term that keeps coming up is the gut-brain axis. So everyone will have heard this kind of term, but no one really have a deep understanding of what it actually means. Could you dive into that for us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It is fascinating. It's fascinating stuff, right? So I guess if you think about it from the brain, so the gut brain axis basically is like a two-directional communication system that our body has in its kind of simplest form. And it's some of that's through nerves, but some of it is not, right? So some of it's through hormones and stuff as well. So it's not all just nerve mediated. But we think about the brain to the gut part, it's fairly well appreciated that this is a thing, right? Because if you look even at language, something scared me sick, or you make me sick looking at you, or that frightened the shite out of me. I mean, that one's not accurate. If anything, the opposite happens. If you're scared, you tend to shut down your GI motility. Because obviously you don't want to be running away from a woolly mammoth and then going, I'm just going to nip in behind a tree here for a minute. But like these have been in our language for so long because it's fairly well appreciated. But people don't understand the level of engagement that the brain has. Look, the first part of your digestive system is all brain driven, right? So even like you see these fancy restaurants, like I remember there was Heston Blumenthal, who by the way has a science degree. So he was doing these things where you'd get your meal, but it would come with a set of headphones that was playing music, and it was like steam and all sorts of faff. And people thought, this is ridiculous. Like, this doesn't change how the food tastes. But the reality is it absolutely does, right? So once your brain starts thinking about food, like if we start talking about food now, and I start talking about like a lovely juicy steak sizzling on one of those cast iron plates with the onions and everything, like automatically you start salivating, right? Because that's what's happening. Your brain stimulates this kind of saliva production. And that saliva contains enzymes that start working even before the food gets there. They're kind of spreading out. And then once you eat the food, that saliva spreads the food around your mouth and it hits all the different taste buds. And now all of a sudden the food starts to taste better. But that keeps on trafficking. Like your brain keeps saying, okay, now we want to get the stomach to start making acid, right? So we're going to need acid in 10 minutes from now. I could wait till the food is already in my stomach, or I could anticipate it and I could start, eating and, or producing more acid. And that's helpful to kind of get your digestion going. And it also makes your bowel movement, your bowel starts to move, because it says, look, if we don't, we're going to have a backlog somewhere, unfortunately, possibly choice of phrase, but you're going to have a backlog at some point, right? If you don't get things moving. And so that's why the brain says, right, straight away, start pushing things down to make more room for what's coming next. And so that part's been all really fairly well established. What's become much more nuanced and much newer, I guess, is the idea that the reverse can also happen, right? So the notion that, for example, if you take warm milk, right? Warm milk goes into your stomach. It's broken down from, there's a chemical in it called tryptophan, and that gets broken down into something else called melatonin, which gives you that lovely, relaxy, sleepy feeling, right? And so that's literally your stomach saying to your brain, this is how we want you to respond. And we've seen that with stuff like turmeric. There's loads of these different kind of things within your stomach that can then trigger back into your brain. And more recently, we've discovered actually bacteria can do this as well, right? So bacteria, for example, produce a chemical that's it's a little bit like cannabis, actually. And the reason they produce it is because they want you to feel good. So when you eat something that they want, then you feel good about it. And that makes them obviously thrive and do well. And so they've found different ways to sort of manipulate us, if you like. I mean, and let's face it, like there's 10 times as many bacteria in your body as there are human cells. So really, they are kind of in charge. But they've found ways to manipulate you by saying, well, we're going to give you a bit more of this, short chain fatty acids, which are really good for you and really promote good brain function in a way to try and encourage you to eat more of the food that we want. And so it's very much a two-way street.
Yeah, I remember hearing an argument before about humans aren't the center of God's universe, that the bacteria, the only reason that we exist is for the bacteria to exist. So it's a very interesting one. But just in the sense of gut inflammation, we now know that it's a two-way street between the gut-brain axis. And just wondering, how can gut inflammation, I suppose, have a negative effect on maybe our mental health, maybe causing anxiety, depression, these things?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we know, so there's lots of ways is the short answer, right? So just purely from the inflammation standpoint, right? The immune cells trigger an immune chemical release. They're called cytokines. And they're designed to travel around and spread the inflammation around. And that might mean going to blood vessels and making the blood vessels easier to get through so that more immune cells can get in, or it can travel around the body elsewhere to stimulate more immune cell production within your bone marrow, for example. And so all these different, so the chemical mediators are traveling everywhere. But of course, if they're traveling everywhere, then they'll also get into your brain. And we know that when they get into your brain, then they can affect your brain function. They can change the levels of normal neurotransmitters in the brain, and that can trigger increase in depression or increase in anxiety. All of these things without this, it's independent necessary, or it doesn't have to be dependent on that strict nerve, vagal nerve stimulation. It can happen through cytokines first and foremost, but also through things like hormone release. And so we see like there are certain hormones that we know, and obviously, you can mimic this with food. So if you take things like saffron, we know that changes the levels of neurotransmitter release in the brain that we then associate anxiety. But inflammation blocks that whole system, right? So, under inflammatory conditions, now all of a sudden you're not absorbing enough nutrition, and that has a knock-on effect in terms of producing new transmitters. And so at the same time, your bacteria are not producing short-chain fatty acids like they're supposed to. And so we see a drop-off in things like butyrate and propionate and acetate, all of which are important for regulating your kind of higher brain function.
Very interesting. Yeah, you touched on the vagus nerve there. I know myself, I use NeuroSim, a vagal nerve stimulator. And could you just kind of dive into us how important vagal tone is for gut health?
Oh, it's huge. And I think unfortunately, the extreme case of this is a disease called short gut syndrome, where infants are born with a vagus nerve that doesn't fully develop. And because of that, they've got lower bowel motility issues, and it can be fatal because it can't control bowel function properly. And we know that there's a huge role to play for the enteric nervous system, or the nerves within your intestine, if you like. And bear in mind, and I'm not just saying this because I'm not a neuroscientist, but that's the one that developed first. So evolutionary, in terms of evolution, you have the enteric nervous system came before the central nervous system of the brain. But the enteric nervous system's got a really important role in controlling how everything moves through your gut. My son, when he was a little baby, he was desperate. You've got a thing in your body called your gastrocolic reflex. And it's basically a nerve that sends messages from your stomach to your bowel and says, right, there's food coming, you're going to need to make space. And in an adult, that's quite a long signal. And as a result, there's a good bit of time between one message and the other. But in an infant, because they're obviously quite small, you get a small message. So my son used to eat food, and while he was still sitting at the table, he'd defecate. And so we'd always sit there having our dinner and be like, oh, he's going again. But he just had a very quick reflex. But that's all nerve driven, right? And obviously, the terminal end of the process is self, right? You control that consciously, right? You make that decision when you need to go to the toilet. But everything above that is all completely automated. You've no responsibility. And so that's all controlled by by your gut. And it works both ways, because you've also got pain signals traveling back up to the brain. And that's a huge problem actually within IBD, is that, it's often very hard to know how severe your disease is based on how you feel. Because if it happens to be close to a nerve, literally if it's touching a nerve, then, if that's where the inflammation is, you'll feel an enormous amount of pain. But your disease could be quite mild, but you're very unfortunate in that it's right beside a nerve, right beside a kind of a sensory nerve. Whereas you could be, someone sitting beside you, they're waiting to go in for their endoscopy, and their whole arse is practically falling out. But just because there's no nerve involvement, they're like, oh yeah, I feel great. Everything's fine. And the
100%.
endoscopist's going, I'm not looking at the same thing you are.
Completely.
So it can be really tough.
There's definitely an issue there when people present with symptoms and then they go for colonoscopy, different things, and maybe they're saying, I'm in so much pain, and the colonoscopy is showing, you don't have that very active disease. Yeah. So I think there's a problem there between consultants and patients, where some people feel the consultants aren't believing them, but obviously the disease is not manifesting on the screen in the same way the person is feeling it. So definitely to have that bit of information to make that widely known, is that there is a nerve element to this, and how this will present and how you react to it is very, very, very interesting.
And especially in something like Crohn's, where you've got, you have an area that's very heavily involved and very severely inflamed. And then like less than 10 centimeters further up the gut or further down, or both, you could be perfectly fine. And it's quite zonal in terms of how the gut works, what kind of nutrition it absorbs and what kind of vitamins and everything else that it gets absorbed. And so you could be really lucky or really unlucky in terms of which section you happen to have involved.
Yeah, I know mine was always located mainly in my large intestine. I had my large intestine removed, then it came from my small intestine, but it tended to move on. Whereas I spoke to someone only recently, and when they got diagnosed, they had it in their throat. They had it all down through the digestive system. So definitely presents so differently in so many different people, and in another sense, so individual in that way as well. When it comes to the gut microbiome and the importance of bacteria diversity, my mother always had this hypothesis, right? When I was about 9 years old, 8 years old even, I was exposed to fecal matter in a pool. And she said from shortly after that, I kind of started presenting systems. And when she reflected to think, how the hell could this happen? We have no known genetic component. She always had a bit of a hypothesis that maybe it was something to do with that. Could you speak on that a little bit? If that's
Well, obviously, mothers are invariably 100% right. And I wouldn't challenge that. I know my mother is. And my brother, who's an oncologist, will tell you that her medical knowledge exceeds his significantly. Yes, but actually, well, no, what I would suggest is an alternative possible explanation for that is after they had the fecal incident in the pool, I would imagine they probably increased the chlorine rate in that pool for a short period of time just to make a chlorine shock or something like that, just to clear it out. And I'd say that if there was such a trigger, and I wouldn't say you wouldn't get away with suing them over it, I'd imagine. But if there was, I'd say it was more to do with the chlorine reducing beneficial bacteria that are really important for that mucosal immunity and decreasing. The chlorine can also increase barrier permeability, which will allow penetration of bacteria and things like that across the gut. And that can trigger immune activation and it stimulate an immune response. And the bacteria can also cause its own inflammation, right? So it causes oxidative stress. It releases a lot of oxygen at high speed, these little oxygen bursts that they're designed great for killing bacteria on your surfaces, but obviously not so good if it's killing off bacteria within your body. Because once those bacteria break up, then they release a load of kind of alarm signals to your own immune system. And it says, well, there's loads of bacteria being exploded all around me. Something must be wrong. I need to react and I need to stimulate an immune response to this because it could be something very pathogenic. So yeah, I'd say, because we know, yes, so hygiene, there was a hygiene hypothesis for years that said, if you're too clean, you're putting yourself at risk. And I think there's probably a certain truth to that in infancy, you really do need to be exposed as much as you can. So, for example, in my case, my son had an issue with his bladder. So they put him on antibiotics when he was 12 months old. And we said, okay, fine. But anytime we see a dog, we're like bringing him over to the dog, getting the dog to lick him, all that, as much as we could physically do. Because you do need to be exposed to it early on so that when you see it again as an adult, you're not going to have this massive reaction to it. And I think certain diseases, we see that, there's such thing as being too clean. And again, if you look back at third world countries where, say, sanitation is not as easily accessible and good hygiene practices are more difficult to maintain, we don't see levels of IBD there. So it's not like overexposure to fecal material would be a problem per se. I'd say it was the reaction to that probably triggered, if anything, your issue.
Absolutely. Just want to circle back to the chlorine bit you mentioned. Obviously, chlorine is a massive component of the water we ingest from the taps these days. And I know from a friend of mine lives very close to a water treatment place, so they get the first burst of water from the chlorine treatment place, and the smell of chlorine off their water is so intense. So when it comes to, I know environmental, IBD is much more prevalent in the Western world than it is in other countries. So is there definitely an environmental impact that from what we're ingesting, possibly from the likes of water and things like that, cleaning, that could be having such an effect on our gut?
Yeah, the short answer is 100%. There definitely is an environmental component. There was a scientist in Miami called Maria Abreu. She did a fascinating study on people who'd moved from Puerto Rico to Florida. So almost identical in terms of genetics, but now they were exposed to a totally different environment. And they saw this huge spike in the level of IBD among patients who'd moved from one to the other. And so if we knew what was causing it, then, we could intervene fairly quickly. And there's not been strong evidence to say what it is, whether it was like there's stuff in your toothpaste, there's stuff in your water, there's loads of possible things. But the likelihood is that, yes, we're exposed to something at low levels all the time. And that accumulates to a point that it somehow interferes with your normal immune response. We just don't know what it is.
IBD seems to be like a perfect storm. Yeah, there's just such a combination of different things that could be possible triggers that are obviously coming together to cause this immune reaction in the body. So definitely there's a lot of components, a minefield. From speaking to people who have IBD, everyone, I won't say a blanket statement like everyone, but a lot of people I speak to have a lot of experience of failed therapies or being on a particular therapy for a couple of years and then suddenly it's like they build up an immunity to it and then they have to back to square one trying to figure out a new therapy. Do you speak on that and why people seem to respond that way?
Yes, so I would agree. The intro conversation is I failed on this, this, and this, and I've had this much of my bowel removed. It seems to be quite common. And there's a few reasons for that. So in some cases, none of the therapies that we currently have are effective in everybody. The best of the therapies we do have, probably something like Remicade or infliximab, which is effective in probably about 70% of people. And that's brilliant. Except that by 12 months or 24 months, we start to see that 70% has dropped in half, because basically your body starts to generate antibodies against this antibody, and that clears it out of your system. And then you're kind of back to, even if you're still getting infusions, the drug's cleared out of your system within 24 hours and you're no longer responding to it. And that's, so because that was a problem with Remicade when it first came out, that's what triggered Humira to come out. So Humira is more of a human antibody, whereas Remicade was originally mouse. And they said, well, with Humira, it's going to be much more tolerable and it's not going to have the problem, or, it's going to be much more convenient and everything. And it just didn't really manifest. That didn't turn out to be the case. And so then there was another drug, Cimzia, came out after that. And Cimzia was designed even better, right? So they said, right, well, if you imagine an antibody is like a big Y-shaped kind of drug. And they said, right, well, we know the top half of the Y, like the open arms part, that's the part you actually need. Because that's what basically soaks up all the TNF that's floating around your body and that you're looking to get rid of. But the bottom half is probably a part you don't really need. So we said, we'll just cut that off and we'll make it last longer. And then we'll give it to patients and see if it does make things better. And it just didn't really pan out either. So it's quite common then that you'd fail off one of those biologics quite early, within 12, 24 months. And if you haven't failed within 24 months, then it becomes, I think it's every year after, you're 20% more likely to fail on that. So if you go 3 or 4 years, you're doing incredibly well. The upside of that is we do actually have other options now. And so we've totally different classes of drugs. So we've got the drugs that stop cells from getting to your gut. So that's things like Tisabri and vedolizumab or Entyvio. And we've got other drugs that prevent cells from even wanting to go anywhere. So things like sphingosine-1 or fingolimide, where they'll basically just block all the cells from even getting out of your lymph nodes and going anywhere near your gut. But they all work through. And then we've also got drugs like Xeljanz, which is basically it stops the kind of chemical signals from stimulating inflammation in your body. And so these are 3 totally different classes of drugs that work through totally different ways. So the good news is if you failed on one, you try the next one and then try the next one and then try the next one. About 20 or 15 years ago, there was a suggestion that actually a better strategy is to use a combination of drugs. And it's that's certainly we see that in chemotherapy and in cancer all the time. People will be on 3 or 4 different medications at the same time because they're all toxic. And they say, well, if we give you lower levels of any one of these drugs, it won't be as toxic and the combination will be more effective. And they tried that with IBD. They were using Remicade, but alongside Remicade, they were also given patients mesalamine, another drug. And so kind of general broad spectrum anti-inflammatory drug, as well as a very targeted gut specific or IBD specific drug. And it worked incredibly well, much better than either drug ever worked on their own. And actually the likelihood that you'd fail on the Remicade was much lower because you were also taking this other anti-inflammatory drug at the same time. The problem was it's just really prohibitively expensive. Like IBD is the most expensive GI disease there is to treat, and you're going to be treating it for the rest of your life. So it got to a point where this cost was just enormous. And the idea that adding multiple drugs on top of each other was really, not a viable option. That's probably going to change in the next 5 to 10 years, where we see a lot more of the kind of generic, anti-TNF like drugs coming out. We might see the price come down to the point where we can start adding multiple drugs together. But it's hard to justify and it's hard to test. Whether or not a company will be willing to say, yeah, we're going to test this drug that does both of these things at the same time. It's hard to make any money on that. But in my mind, that would be the best solution.
Yeah, it's killer. A lot of this always comes down to money at the end of the day. Money makes the world go around, unfortunately. Just for a moment, I want to take a break from the pod to speak to you about Ostique Connect from Sol's Healthcare. One of the hardest things about living with a stoma or living with IBD can be the isolation that comes with it. I know from my own experience, chronic illness can be a very lonely place. I've been very vocal about the effect it had on me in my teenage years and how my actual fear of getting a stoma and living life with a bag nearly ended up me not being here today. If I'd had a way to connect with other people who were living with IBD or they were living with a stoma, I could have learned from their lived experience. It would have eased so much the fear of what I was going through. Connecting and learning from another is exactly why I started this podcast, which is why I want to tell you about Ostique Connect by Salts. It's the first ever peer-to-peer support app for people who are managing gut health conditions. So whether you have a stoma now, maybe you'll have one in the future, or you've had one in the past, Ostique Connect has a bespoke algorithm that helps you meet people from all over the world. People who've been on a similar journey to your own. So through the app, you can make supportive connections and you can have one-to-one conversations. It also gives you the chance to join forums and connect with a larger group of people. You can ask and you can answer any questions that arise. It's a great place to provide support in a safe space. And there's also helpful blogs and there's podcast episodes too. Austique Connect by Salts is available to download via the Apple App Store and Google Play. So if you want to check it out, click the links in the episode description or simply search Austique Connect. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the episode. Just back to your own research, is there kind of a time frame when you're kind of hoping it might be able to come to market, or what's that looking like?
Oh yeah, we don't think about that. Obviously, we always do. We think about it from day one. Because if you don't think about it from day one and you don't protect kind of the intellectual property, and I've seen this personally, I've seen this before where we had two drugs, both were effective in a preclinical, like in an animal model, and none of them ever went anywhere. And none of them probably ever, or neither one of them probably will ever go anywhere. Even by the time we patent them, it was kind of a bit too late, really. But they say it takes on average about 20 years for a drug to get from bench to kind of to bedside, or from preclinical lab all the way through to clinical use. And that seems to be accelerating a little bit. There's a weird scenario in IBD patients at the moment that we've had a lot of clinical trials that we're looking at just different versions of Remicade. Because, every new kind of biosimilar drug that came out also needed a clinical trial because it wasn't exactly the same. It's not like, your ibuprofen. It doesn't matter whether it's Walprofen or whatever kind of profen it is. It's the same drug, just made by a different company. That's not true with antibodies. They're a bit more complex. And so they had to go through clinical trials. So we've had a real kind of backlog in the IBD space in terms of new drugs coming through clinical trials because they've been clogged up with these other drugs. But yeah, so at the moment we're looking kind of 15-ish years. But then the other factor is, of the stuff that we work on, obviously 90% of what we do fails, which is pretty good. Get very excited when the 10% happens. But of the 10% that get through preclinical trial testing, about 90% of those will fail at a clinical stage. And we've gotten better at that. The reason they fail has changed a lot. But it still is the attrition rate's huge. So the idea is if you can make it fail early, because if it fails late, that's really expensive. But yeah, so hopefully we're looking at maybe 20 years time.
And is that for it to be on the market, or is that to start clinical trials?
I know clinical trials come much sooner than that. So we could probably start those in about 5 years, if even. But just to get it all the way through and approved and everything is a huge job, bigger than what we are as well. So we have to get an awful lot of help in to get that successfully kind of moved on. But yeah, it's tough. And we've seen loads of stories of drugs that were very successful and then just never ever got anywhere because for whatever financial reasons. Beyond just
very disheartening to hear. As a patient suffering with these issues, you're thinking, oh my God, you yourself, if you had the money, would throw any amount at it to bring it to market, obviously. Right. But there's such a financial component to everything in the world, unfortunately. And that's just the nature of the modern world, capitalist society.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't, I'll be honest, in Ireland, it doesn't help that there's no appetite at all for people to invest in research. We fund, as a nation, research probably less than a third of what similar grossing industry, countries around us put money into. And it's just because people don't care, or they think someone else will do it. Like, this doesn't need to be an Irish problem. When your politicians call to the door, you can be pretty sure that no one's saying to them, yeah, we need more biomedical research. And it's madness because the reality is it's a money spinner as well, right? So if we train PhD students and they go out and get real jobs, not in academia, obviously, but they earn significantly higher salaries. They're less prone to the kind of fluctuations that we see with boom and bust kind of periods. Like, PhDs tend to stay employed indefinitely. And as a result, they bring in something like 7 times the money that you invest in their education. They bring that back into the exchequer in terms of the taxes and everything else. So yeah, it would be a huge money spinner to say, right, well, let's boost our biomedical research capacity in Ireland. But there just is we don't trust ourselves to be good at this sort of thing. We could have world experts in Ireland and we'd still be critical of them and assume that someone else could do it better. And that's fine, except that the reality is other countries don't care as much as we do about IBD or about celiac disease because it's not as big a problem. Whereas here, we've got one of the highest new rates of IBD cases in the world. We've got one of the highest rates of celiac disease in the world. And yet, we're not investing tons of money in it because we just think, the Americans will get around to it eventually, or someone else will come back with the answer.
The collective hive mind of the Irish psyche, they're better than us. No, things definitely change in that respect. Like, we have a highly educated people. Like, the amount of people that go into third level education in this country is a massive percentage. So, we're in a great position to move forward in the world in the terms of research. So hopefully something will change in the coming years.
Hopefully it'll be lovely.
Just in the sense of patient involvement in everything that you're trying to do, how important is it for patients to document everything they're experiencing? Maybe that would be from the simplest respect, journaling or wearing things like, say, a health tracker. I wear a Whoop myself, it tracks my HRV and things like that. How important is patients collecting that data for the work you try to do?
I think, to be honest, like knowledge is power, right? So for years, IBD was treated as it was like that, that trick where you put a Rubik's cube inside a black bag, and you've got to put your hands inside the black bag and fix the Rubik's cube, and like these people could do it, and it was amazing. That's kind of how IBD has been for years, right? So we have loads of great therapies, we've got loads of great doctors who are very, very educated, but it's been a bit of a black box. Whereas I think what is changing and what will continue to change is, first of all, patients will start taking ownership of their disease, right? Because everybody's unique, and you know better than anyone else how you're feeling, how much energy you have, and how how you might be responding to treatment within reason. I mean, we talked already about how you might not feel pain the way, depending on where the disease was or whatever. But you certainly know your bowel movement frequency and whether that's going up or down. You'll catch problems much quicker than a routine checkup every 3 or 6 months or whatever. So it's important for patients to say, right, I'll take responsibility and I'll take charge of this. And I won't, I won't. No, it's not. You can have trust and you can have an open conversation with your doctor, but be prepared to show the evidence to say, look, this is where I was at before, and this is where I was at now. I think there's a problem, and they can say yes, there is, or no, there isn't, based on their expertise. But if they can see the data, it's much easier for them to make that informed decision, as opposed to saying, you're the 15th person I've seen today who said the same thing. It's just that time of year, or it could be something else, or, it's been really dull the last couple of weeks. Everyone's pissed off and no one's got any energy. Like, that's nothing to do with your IBD. So like I said, having power and having kind of that data that you can say, this isn't my thoughts. This is empirical data that says that this is true. Whether I like it or not, this is what's changed. I think that's incredibly useful. And I think we'll see more and more of that as time goes on, with better wearables and better home testing. Like, we saw during COVID, people are great at doing tests for themselves at home. But the technology, apart from Thanos, like the technology that's around that has exploded, and it's actually gotten really sophisticated. So you can start testing yourself for your lactoferrin levels or your calprotectin levels, or there's a load of tests that you could that if there was a system where that was supported by your doctor, that you could easily manage to do that at home and say, yeah. And like, there's systems now in the US that they've developed where you're doing that every day. You're plugging that into an app. The app goes to your gastroenterologist, and then they can track it. And so before they see you next, or if they see something that they don't like, they can reach out to you and say, right, we'll have you come in early. Don't wait until you're due to be back. Come in a week early and we'll check you out, make sure everything's okay. Because it looks to me like you're having an issue.
Yeah, early prevention is the key to avoiding serious problems in the future. That seems like amazing technology, which I hope is implemented here very soon, because we unfortunately seem to be always at the end of the curve. But
Yeah.
no, that's wicked interesting. Just in the sense of patient collaboration between researchers and consultants and everyone involved in the kind of gastro environment. I know recently UCD Conway invited people in to see the research, or to see the lab and stuff like that. How important do you think it is, the collaboration between patients, researchers, consultants, that there's more of an open conversation so we all kind of know what's going on?
Yeah, I think so it's hugely important. Like, so I've been working on that sort of end of the spectrum since I started, actually. When I started my IBD research, I got a grant from a charity called the Crohn's Colitis Foundation. And they were so organized and so keen to have that kind of communication process started. And like, it starts easy enough with education. And that's what really the Conway lab tour was about, kind of demystifying what it is we're doing. And like, it's a lot of fun for us, I think. First and foremost, that's not the only reason why we do it, but that's one of the main reasons we really get a kick out of it. And like, everybody working in the labs loves the fact that people come in and look at what we're doing, and they're so interested, and everybody wants to know what's going on and what this does, and like stuff that we can see it every day. So we get kind of complacent, and we start to take stuff for granted, and to have someone see it through fresh eyes and be like, oh wow, that's cool that you can get DNA straight from there and put it into there and do this, that. And then we're like, yeah, no, it is kind of fun. So it's nice for us from that perspective. And then it's nice to chat with patients and ask them what they want, because a lot of the times we're traditionally, like, scientists are off working away in their dark little lab, coming up with what they think is the best solution. Whereas from a patient perspective, we're being told the opposite. And so, like, UCD has a big patient engagement or patient involvement program. And there's been some incredible stories, like, the people who had butterfly disease, where this brittle skin, and so that they brought scientists together, and the patients said, well, actually, we don't really, what you're worrying about or what you're working on is great, trying to understand the disease and everything. But actually, in the short term, what we'd really like is a drug that would just numb the pain for 2 days instead of 1 day. And the scientists were like, that's really, like, that's dead easy. Like, why would you want that? And they're like, well, we can't change bandages more than every 2 days. So right now we put on the cream, it gives a certain level of pain relief, but it only lasts for 24 hours. We can't take the bandage off, put on more cream. We've got to go for another 24 hours before we can change the bandages. So that's 24, every second day, basically, our child is in extreme pain. And it was awful in the sense that the scientists were like, yeah, that's a really easy thing to fix. Like, we can just reformulate your medication in the cream so that some of it will come out straight away, some of it will take a little bit longer to come out, but basically it'll be slow release over the course of the 48 hours, and that'll suit your treatment. But it was game changing in terms of patient care, right? Because now they were getting kind of continuous relief as opposed to every second day being in agony. And so that for those of us kind of working in an area where there's such an active patient group, to be able to look at that and go, okay, that's the model we're striving for, right? We want to know what patients want us to work on so that we can target our therapy, our development appropriately. Like, if someone says, look, nobody likes cannabis, why would you even work on it? I'll say, fine. Or if you said to me, well, I'd never take a drug that was somehow cannabis related because I just think it's, I don't approve, then I say, okay, well, if everybody feels that way, maybe there's no point to me investing my time and effort in it. But if that's not the case and people are saying, look, I want to use cannabis, there's a bunch of reasons why it's great. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't. Then, again, that's what really drove me to look at it in the first place, was people saying to me, yeah, I don't see a problem here. Why can't my 12-year-old child take his THC gummies when it makes them feel better? Yeah, my only answer was, okay, that's fair. I need to have a good reason to tell you that they probably shouldn't. So it's great to get patients who are so cued in and so on the ball and have been on, or, in around the kind of disease and sharing information with each other, and to get involved in that is really rewarding, because you get useful information as opposed to, well, this disease or this mechanism might be interesting, or this new protein that's been discovered might be really important. If people don't want it, then what's the point? Like, that's no interest to us. And then we can flip it the other way around. Like, so I've heard stuff from patients that I'm absolutely horrified by, saying, oh, I did this because I was told that it would have this horrific outcome. And you're like, no, like, that's not at all true. Like, the science certainly doesn't support that. And at least if I can do nothing else, I can tell you what the science says. I won't ever say, here's what I think, because I'm not a clinician, right? So I'll never say, here's what I would recommend. But what I can easily do is say, well, I've read the papers. I know what the science has said. And it says this is fine and this is okay and this won't happen. And that's been patients who I've kind of had that conversation with have been really appreciative of like, yeah, that's just easy and straightforward and clear. And there's a lot of myths and stuff going around. There's a lot of misinformation online. And so I honestly do think it's our job as scientists to say, look, I'm calling bullshit on that one.
I think that's definitely the power of collaboration, is it removing the barriers, as you did, allowing people in to see what's going on and have an open conversation to say, what do you experience and what should be working on? That's a powerful thing to do, really and truly. And it makes people feel, I know this is a very cliche internet word, but to feel seen, to feel that the people who are doing the research actually know why they're doing the research for the people that are actually experiencing the problem. So that's amazing. It really is a great way to look at things. But just one question I have for you, from your understanding of the science and from everything we've talked about today, like, I've learned so much in the neurological component and gut-brain axis. What do you think needs to change in maybe the approach to how IBD is treated? I know we spoke on how stress is a major factor. From my own experience in a clinic, it's medication, whereas the mental is kind of forgotten about. In your opinion, or from what the science says, what do you think maybe possibly needs to change in that regard?
Yeah, I think, and again, I do like stealing other people's ideas. That's kind of how we operate. But if you look at the cancer space, they've really gotten way ahead of us in terms of recognizing that lifestyle, as well as obviously good chemotherapy, like good drugs or effective drugs. That's a different conversation. But they've recognized that it's the combination of those things works way better than good therapies alone, right? So, if you're involved in a health and fitness program as well as taking chemo, it seems that the chemo works much better. You tolerate it better, and there's loads of beneficial outcomes like that. And I certainly think, when I left Colorado, that was really where they were moving in it as a very kind of, they would have been one of the kind of most cutting edge IBD therapeutic centers in the country, in the US. And so they were saying, right, well, we'll shift from just having your doctor or just having an IBD nurse. We're going to have an IBD team that involves your psychologist, your dietitian, your physiotherapy, you name it. Every possible facet of you as a person, all of those things feed into your disease. So managing your stress it may benefit you to do yoga. It may benefit you to do, breathing exercises or some sort of cognitive therapy, which will have an impact on controlling your pain as well as managing your disease symptoms. And so, yeah, absolutely don't stop. Like we will still push on and try and produce better therapeutics because that's our job. But we're part of a bigger team of people who say, well, yeah, we'll cover this part ourselves because we're the experts in this area. And we'll cover this part, we're the experts there. And as long as they all understand each other and they do it as a group and they're not pulling and pushing you in multiple directions, then that's the best outcome for patients. The challenge with that is A, it's expensive, and B, it's time consuming. And I think, ironically enough, that's where we'll see shifts in terms of AI, because there are fairly fixed indices of, oh, well, here's how bad your stress levels are, or here's how bad your disease severity is. We've got some great ways of measuring that. And if you can measure that accurately, then you can say, okay, well, based on this, you probably would benefit from doing some sort of guided meditation. And so we have an app that will, instead of you having to sit down with a psychologist, you can have a guided app that will just lead you through that. And, at the same time, we're tracking your nutrition and we're saying, well, you're not getting enough of this, you're not getting enough of that. So we can suggest based on that you need to increase your intake of certain vegetables or whatever it is, or protein or whatever. And again, that's something that an app can help to really kind of tailor to each individual patient. So the idea is we want to get to personalized medicine for individuals, because especially in something like IBD, where people are so diverse in terms of the sort of disease they have, but also time-wise, they're diverse in that, you might be in an active flare. I could meet you a week later and your flare is completely resolved and you're in remission and you're doing great. I meet you 6 months later and it's a different story altogether. The timing of the disease and the type of disease means that everybody's got to be treated individually. There is no one right way to treat. We say, oh, you've got Crohn's, you're 26 and you're male. Oh, we have to give you this therapy. Like that's not a good strategy. And luckily, I think we're shifting away from. So we used to have a system where it was, you take the drug, and as long as your symptoms seem under control, we assume the drug is working and everything's fine. And we shifted away from that to what's called a treated target, where we say our target in this instance is your mucosal healing. So that epithelial barrier and everything underneath it, we want to see that healed. And so we'll keep giving you medicine until that's happened. And if it's not happening with this medicine, we'll switch you to a different medicine. You could feel fine, but treat to target says it doesn't matter how you feel about it. What matters is that the disease is actually under control. And that, traditionally that would have required endoscopy and stuff like that to monitor that. But now we're seeing great advances with stuff like pill endoscopy, where you can get a tiny little pill. Like they used to, I remember when they came out first and they were huge. You were like, it's a small horse is going to be taken out. Like they're definitely not for kids.
How am I going to get that out?
I wouldn't want to go in. I would much less coming out. But, and especially people, if you've got a stricture of any sort at all, it was like, well, that's an absolute no-no, because that's not coming out. A surgeon's going to have to get that out. And so it became, that was prohibitive, but they've gotten so much smaller and so much more sophisticated now and so much more higher resolution. And I think the next phase of that's going to be, well, that video feed is going to be automatically analyzed. So an AI tool that's used to watching endoscopies because it's seen billions of endoscopies because there's billions of them recorded already. So you could theoretically train an AI to look at that and say, right, well, there's information here, there's information there. And eventually it'll be better than a human at doing it. Some of my best mates are endoscopists and I feel sorry for them.
They're out of a job.
Yeah, Adam, they're probably happy enough to retire at this stage.
They've seen enough. That's so interesting. Just when it comes to, I suppose, any messaging you'd like to get across to someone who might be suffering with IBD, or in the same sense, someone who is treating IBD, what, from your own experience, would you like to get across to them?
Don't use cannabis. That's key, right? For all the reasons, in spite of all the reasons why it might make you feel better, I 100% promise it is making your disease worse. So if I got nothing else here today, I would say take that on board, please. And that's my PSA, or PSA? Other than that, I think there is hope. I think we're making progress, and I think progress is moving faster than it used to. We can joke about COVID, obviously, but now it's over, or it's mostly over. But if you look at how fast COVID brought a drug to market, that's incredible. And obviously, this probably is or unlikely to be a vaccine situation with IBD treatments. But we've certainly seen that drug to market is accelerating. The process of getting a drug to market is accelerating. And as I said already, the reasons drugs used to fail was mostly for toxic, they were toxic in some way that we hadn't identified previously. And we're getting so much better at identifying that before the drugs even developed in the first place. So we should, in theory, start to see a decrease in the number of fails. we're not going to be failing constantly in the future. But I think IBD is an exciting space at the moment. We're seeing lots of real exciting developments, especially around the areas of oral drug delivery. So stuff that even big drugs, things like Remicade or something where it has to be given by infusion, those sort of treatments. Like there's an Entyvio equivalent that's going to be coming out soon that's orally delivered. And I think that would be huge for people. Save you the hassle of going into hospital and sitting there for 4 hours waiting for your infusion to finish. I'm sure it's great from a social standpoint, but it would be nice to not have to deal with that. But what happens then is the cost comes down. And I think the cost of treating patients won't drop. It'll be a redistribution or a redirection of that money to somewhere else. And so we'll start to see further developments kind of on the back of that once the medication starts getting cheaper. That's what I hope.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's great to hear that things are moving in the right direction rather than someone saying, we don't know if there's anything coming. Because a lot of people I speak to with IBD who have tried so many different medications, like hope is a dangerous thing, as they say. And I recently was told that hope was the best medication. And for myself, I used to always be so fearful. I tried so many drugs and thinking, there's nothing left to treat me. Like you get that real fear state that comes in. So to know that there is massive advancements coming in the line of IBD care is great to hear. And just a sense of kind of understanding the man behind the microscope, I'm going to put you on the spot here. It's a question I tend to ask all my guests, I suppose. What does happiness feel like to you?
Well, all right. Well, so imagine
no pressure.
Yeah, no. It is tough, right? So if happiness was getting to the point of having a therapy that worked, I would not be a very happy person, right? But it's like, like let's say if someone says to me, I want you to go and climb the 12 bends, right? Just go out there and knock it out. And you look at that up front and think, this is huge, right? I can't do this. It's too much. I'm never going to be the person who gets to the other end of this. And so that's kind of, to some extent, that's how I have felt in the past. Let's put it that way. But, what I can do is I can take 1 or 2 steps at a time and I make some progress. And I feel like that's something positive, right? And I'm also really lucky in that I'm not making this journey by myself. So my wife is actually an IBD researcher, and that helps enormously. They say, Gary and Bert Boher, like the two of us shorten the road or whatever. So it means that, if I get 2 feet deep in the wrong thing, she knows exactly what I'm doing and where I'm at. And she's able to kind of pull me back and say, look, get you back on target. And equally, if she's gone, as she often does, overloaded herself with stuff and she's practically about to keel over, then she knows I'm there. And I can, put a hand on her shoulder or, push her back upright and help her move a little bit further on as well. For the most part, that works great. We both hit high, like we both hit peaks on occasion, and it feels amazing. And actually, the best peaks we've hit have been peaks we've hit together in the same day. Like, for example, because we both work in the same disease, we both put grant applications into the same NIH study section. And one day, we both got $500,000 grant from the National Institute of Health in the US. And like it was a 5-year thing at a time when we had no security in our jobs whatsoever. We were like, that's it. Let's go have kids instantly because we'll at least have a job for 5 years. But it's lovely. Like getting up those peaks, those peaks are great. Together, they're even better. But the reality is they don't last for any length of time. Like, we've got awards and prizes and papers and, being invitations to come on podcasts. Like they're great. They're brilliant. I love them. They keep me going, but they don't last any length of time, right? Within a couple of days, I'm back smack down to earth. Something has gone wrong or something else isn't the way we want it to be. And so it becomes a situation of we have to just enjoy the road, right? You can't enjoy the destination because you might never get there. So I just enjoy the job. Like I enjoy the people I work with. Great people. Billy, one of the lads, he's a PhD student in my lab at the moment. He's fascinating. He's fantastic, super smart, super engaged. But he pushes me more than I think I push him. And I've loads of collaborators. Like in UCD, we're lucky. We've got a whole group of GI researchers, and we all work together. We all share reagents, share knowledge, share everything. And having that kind of community around you really helps keep you going. Because if it was all about where you get to, then you'd be pretty depressed pretty early on. So you just have to take it slow and enjoy the road, as they say.
And what a power couple, aren't we blessed to have you?
I will say some of the time it feels like I'm chasing her. And she's right now miles ahead of me.
The better half.
Yeah, no question. There's a definite trailing spouse in our family.
The power of the feminine.
Yeah, I hope she'll drag me along behind her somewhere.
Sounds like you've got a great dynamic going on.
Oh yeah, she keeps me honest, definitely.
Where you just come up to the hour mark, have you any kind of final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd say there's a time when this disease as a diagnosis was an awful lot worse than it is now. I think, there's been extreme examples of people like, playing soccer for Man United or winning gold medals in rowing or, playing tennis or in Wimbledon. Like there's loads of examples of individuals who've done incredibly well about it. Well, while battling the disease. But for me, my experience has been, and I think one of the things that really kind of drives me has been, I expected initially when I met people who had the disease to be very negative and very, bitter and unhappy about the fact that they have a disease that's really debilitating. And I've only ever met the opposite. I've always been blown away by how resilient and how positive people are, because they've said, well, yeah, I have this, but here's how I'm getting through it, or here's how I'm getting over it. And I think that's incredible. Like I wouldn't wish it on someone, but I think I'm still amazed at how well people cope and people manage with it. And I think it's great for people who come into just gotten the disease now to know that there's this huge community, worldwide community now, of people who have, been through the horrors of realizing that they have this disease and are showing almost on a daily basis, here's how you get through it, or here's how you cope with it. And they're really generous and they're really keen to share their experiences. And I think that's really powerful. I don't think I've certainly never seen a community like that with a different disease.
I think so many
yeah, I
people in
don't
the
know if
IBD community have such an understanding of the negatives and the pain that people go through that they're very supportive and happy to share their stories and collaborate with each other to help each other go through it, because it is a disease that burdens every part of your life. And in the sense of an invisibleness, people can look at you and say, oh, yeah, sure, you look healthy. But like only someone else with IBD will really know what's going on behind the scenes. And as you mentioned there about bitterness, I know myself, bitterness is a poison that can kind of just seep into you. And I think everyone goes through a stage really in the early days where there is probably a bit of bitterness, but you do become quite resilient from your experience, and from that you get to be able to move forward and look at the positives. And I suppose we all stand on the shoulders of everyone else who I suppose came before us, which allows the movement in research. Because I think I remember speaking to a consultant before who said 50 years ago this disease was unfortunately killing people. So we have come so far from the research that has gone on and the collaboration between patients and everything else. So I think it's great to have these open conversations and sharing all the knowledge. I've learned so much today, so I have to say you've really opened my eyes, and this is something I've had for over 20 years, and you're still teaching me. So you always keep learning about IBD. So
I'm still learning too.
It's an ever evolving beast. But Colm, I really want to thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
That was episode 16 of the Survival Project. If this conversation gave you new insight like it did me, send to someone who you think needs to hear it. I have to say that was one of the most educational conversations I've ever had, and as someone with IBD for over 20 years, it really filled in a lot of, I suppose, the hypotheses I had maybe in some sense, and a lot of the gaps in my own knowledge. So I really want to say a massive thank you to Colm for coming on and sharing his knowledge. If you're listening to this on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, a quick follow and a rating really, really helps more than you think. Your support helps me to grow, and without your likes and your listens, this podcast will not go anywhere. So I want to say a massive thank you for supporting me, and a massive thank you to Souls Healthcare. If you'd like to get in contact with a fellow IBD warrior for support or else to support, I'd highly recommend checking out Osteoconnect. The link is in my bio, and I'll see you next week for episode 17.